Hi, I'm Rory, and with me, as always, is Ken. How are you doing today, Ken?
I'm exceptionally well. Thank you for asking, Rory. And both Rory and I hope that you are well. You've
Mm.
joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast, and you've joined us at episode 251. Three stops on today's journey, starting off with theory in practice, where we take some theory, look at how that shows up in practice. And today we're going to explore the four pillars of Gestalt therapy. Interesting topic. Then we go into practice today, where we look at what's current, what are the contemporary challenges or wins that we face as counselors. And today, an important topic, talking about sexual intimacy, something that certainly comes up in the therapy room. And then we go into practice matters. That's our CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast, sponsored by our CPD library. And today, Rory, you're looking at the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD.
Indeed, I met up with an expert in the field, Lou Lebentz, who's done a fantastic lecture for our counselling study resource library and our CPD resource library on the difference between complex post-traumatic stress and post-traumatic stress. An interesting conversation, Ken.
Looking forward to that. So let's dive in with our first topic, theory and practice, the four pillars, Rory, of Gestalt therapy. Let's start by kind of outlining what that theory is, and then we can look at how does that come to life in the therapy room.
Yes, well, I think that the four pillars are four theoretical ideas. So if we think of them as a tabletop and the pillars being the legs, it's what holds the tabletop up. It's what holds the theory up. The first one is phenomenology, which, of course, for those people who are studying person-centered therapy, will be quite a familiar term, which, of course, is someone's experience of the world, how the individual views their world. Sometimes can be referred to as lived experience. That's phenomenology. Then we talk about the dialogical relationship, and that is usually the relationship between the therapist and the client. Field theory, that is what's going on around the client, what's happening around the client. And then finally, and this, I think this is really what kind of makes Gestalt therapy fairly unique, experimentation, where clients are encouraged or supported by the therapist to do experiments and check out if their phenomenological perception is correct or it can be altered. And those are the four pillars, Ken.
Yes. And I like phenomenology. I'm going to start there. It's kind of what is it? Is Anna, I think, is the person of this quote. We see the world not as it is, but as we are. We have our own, I guess, phenomenological way of seeing the world around us and experiencing the world around us. And I think that Gestalt, first of all, recognizes that as one of the pillars. The person, the client that is in front of you has their life and their way that they interact and see the world. And it's about recognizing that, I guess, and welcoming that in therapy. And I guess how we might see this come up is that the client may speak a truth. And it may be that for you as the therapist, that's not your truth, but it's their truth. So there we're seeing it come up, and how might we work with that, Rory? So we hold our own truth, but now a client comes in and brings what is a truth for them in their phenomenological view of the world. How might that impact us as a therapist? It might set something off in us. We might internally go, oh no, that's wrong. It's not like that. It's like this. And I think that's where we can get lost. And I guess the job is being with them in their view of that.
It is. It's about, phenomenology is about someone's worldview. And sometimes clients will bring a worldview that, people may find different to their worldview, even, offensive. I mean, they may have a view on certain types of people or certain sexualities, which may not be your view of the world. But I think that if you meet the client where they are, using empathy and curiosity and try to explore what brought them to that and help them to, they're exploring that, then we may get an understanding of how they formed their views. And through the arc of therapy, sometimes people actually change their mind. I think that's an interesting thing. We don't actually go out to change people's minds, but actually once they've said something, once it's out there, you can inspect it in the therapy room. It's like bringing something out of a locked box, isn't it? And you put it on the table and you open it up, and then you both peer into this box, and you both kind of move things about in this box and pick things up and look at them. And part of that therapeutic engagement, I think, in any therapy is about saying, well, what does this mean? What does this mean to you? What feelings does this invoke in you? Or sometimes, what thoughts does this invoke in you? And sometimes during that phenomenological inquiry that therapists engage in with their clients, different meanings can be formed. So it may be that the initial meaning of something changes through the arc of therapy. And it's like, I thought it was this, but now I think it's that.
Yes. Oh, I love that. That's such a beautiful explanation of that, Rory. Now, we're saying four pillars here, and we've spoken about that first pillar, that phenomenological view or phenomenology. But phenomenology would be useless. We wouldn't understand it. We wouldn't be able to understand their view on the world if we didn't enter into dialogue, which is our second area of the second pillar of Gestalt, is that dialogical relationship. And of course, dialogical, referring to there needs to be a dialogue between you as the therapist and them as the client. You're sharing that experience. You're doing exactly as you just said there, Rory. What does that bring up for you? What does that mean for you? It's looking in that box and talking about it so we can get a shared understanding.
Absolutely. And this, one of the big terms in Gestalt therapy is contact, whether it's the client's contact with themselves, their own processes, or the therapist's contact with them, contacting their phenomenological view of the world. So, for any therapist, but certainly in Gestalt, to initiate contact, you have to be present. You have to be, to some extent, vulnerable. You have to be able to see the world through the client's eyes. You have to be empathic. You may do a little bit of self-disclosure in this area, but it is about showing the humanity in yourself and allowing the client to engage with that. And that's where the contact is. It's the contact between the client's lived experience and sharing their story, and you as a therapist working with the client, and the client seeing you as an ally, someone who they can talk to and share their experiences. And crucially, the client perceives you as someone who is trying and working hard to understand their view of the world.
Yeah. I can't help but comment time and time again when we look at all the different theories, how they kind of intertwine and relate to one another. And as you're speaking, you could just as well be speaking about person-centered therapy, bar a few words in there. But they are different therapies, and I guess they're for a reason. And I'd like to share a quote just covering what you've just said. And this is from Yontef and Jacob's book, 2005, page 320. It suggests dialogue is the basis of the Gestalt therapy relationship. In dialogue, the therapist practices inclusion, empathic engagement, and personal presence, e.g. self-disclosure. And I think that that's an important point, because you mentioned that self-disclosure, and that might be where we can kind of see the paths maybe splitting from other theories where we're maybe not encouraged to self-expose. So how might that show in the therapy room with self-disclosure from the therapist's point of view? And what we don't want to be doing, I guess, is taking the spotlight onto ourselves. So if a client shares something, self-disclosure is not saying, oh, I had something similar that happened to me, let me tell you about that. That's not self-disclosure. I think self-disclosure is more appropriate where somebody brings something and you might share that you have an understanding of how that might be or feel or relate to them because of maybe a personal experience, but we wouldn't want to take the baton and say, well, that's nothing, let me tell you about what happened to me type of vibe.
No, I mean, I think the best example of that actually came from a TV program called Cold Feet, which was very popular in the 90s. And it was about one of the characters who went to visit a therapist because one of the other characters had died. And the character who was playing the client was concerned that people weren't grieving enough or grieving in the way that she believed that people should grieve. And the therapist said, it was brilliant. I have to say, it was one of the best examples of self-disclosure I've seen on a TV program. The therapist said, it seems to me that you're concerned that people aren't grieving in the same way you are. And she said, I'll share with you that when my husband had a terminal illness, we both decided that when he died, I'd go scuba diving with turtles. And there was this silence. And as a therapist watching it, it was like, wow, not saying that's what you should do, but that's my experience of grief. And what you're saying is that other people are experiencing it different, and almost inciting a permission to say, I can grieve in the way I want to grieve.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. I'm liking this. I'm liking it. We're now going to go on to that third leg. They're not in particular order, but it's field theory. And so we're recognizing the phenomenology. We're involved in dialogue. We have that dialogical relationship. We're now looking at field theory. We have to recognize, I guess, or that the life the person is leading, their day to day, what's going on for them, is going to influence who they are, what they bring at the time that you're speaking with them.
Absolutely. And within Gestalt, there's three types of field. There's the experiential field, in other words, the phenomenological reality of the client. There's the relational field, and how the therapeutic relationship and the therapist engages with the client. And then there's the wider field, and that wider field can be things that are happening outside the therapy room with different people. And I think crucially, not just on the client side, when as therapists, we have to be aware of what's going on in our own lives and try and bracket that within the relationship. And there's a term sometimes used called shuttling. I love that word, shuttling, like moving very short trips across these three fields. And we may find ourselves, in the relational field, or we may find ourselves in the wider field, talking about things externally to the client, or we may find ourselves in the relational field, where we have to hold a relationship and really be empathic and really try to connect with the client, so that we can support them and build that trust, because that's what the therapeutic relationship is. It's all about trust, and it's flexible, and it's a constant flux. It's a constant movement.
Yeah. And I guess maybe an example in practice, and an example of the time we find ourselves in at the moment, where prices are going up, fuel prices are going up at the time of making this podcast. Inflation is very high. People's mortgage rates are going up, and that is an external field that can have an impact on a lot of people. I'm certainly feeling it myself, and you may very well see that presenting as part of the person's presentation in therapy, and recognizing those different fields, Rory.
Yes, absolutely, and I'm moving across them. I think that it's about pacing is quite an important part, I think, in Gestalt. Making sure that you're in the same place as the client. It's a bit like tennis. Tennis, you're playing in a rectangle with a net in the middle, and there's different areas, and you bat the ball, if that's the word. Please, no letters in the postcard. batting the ball. And I hit the bat with one's racket, I think, is probably the correct expression. And within that, you move around, and for that relational ball, the therapy, to keep in play, because I'm really stretching the metaphors here, Ken, you have to move around the different areas of the pitch. And I guess that's a good way of thinking of that the field is literally a good example. It's a field. You're playing within a pitch, and you're moving around those different areas to keep the therapeutic ball in play.
Yeah. So that field theory. And then, of course, we go on to the fourth pillar, or the fourth leg holding up the table, that is Gestalt underpinning, and that is experimentation. And this is an interesting part. And here again, I guess it's where maybe the split in the road comes from other theories. So person-centered, we would not be working with experimentation. But Gestalt is known for experimentation. And of course, the empty chair is like a very well-known example of that, Rory.
It is. And I mean, I'm sure a lot of people who are listening to this may use empty chair. And for those of you who are maybe new to this, what is empty chair? Well, say, for instance, you have a client who has unfinished business with a former partner they've not seen for a long time. What you would do is, if the client agreed to it, it would have to be contracted. It's not something for early work in therapy. I think it's something when the client's settled in and the client knows the way that you work and trust has been built. You could say to the client, well, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask you to sit in your chair. I'm going to put an empty chair in front of you. And I'm going to ask you to imagine that your ex-partner sat in that chair. Mm-hmm. And what do you want to say to them? And it's a way of allowing someone to speak the unsaid. They can say that to them. And, sometimes, you can interject and say, what do you think he or she may say back to you? And how would you respond to that? And what happens is it's a way of, within Gestalt, it's all about contact, not only with the client and the therapist, but internal contact with oneself, the client making contact with disconnected parts of themselves. And part of that is to form that contact. And it's encouraged. And even you could even say there's a little bit of CBT element in that. It might be someone says, I'm a bit worried about going to a party and standing talking to people and say, well, why not try it out? Just see how it goes. Come back and tell me how it goes.
Yep.
And then you could do a debrief. And you're absolutely right, Ken. It is it does make Gestalt stand out a little bit more than say person-centered therapy, because it's a more active, directive approach, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. And those experiments can be incredibly powerful. One example that springs to mind for myself is maybe working with a client, and the client has experienced a loss, or somebody is around that they have unfinished business with, but maybe that person has passed away, and then there's no way of contacting them or getting them. So the empty chair is one way of doing that, which is quite verbal, and it's in the room, maybe with the therapist. But a private and more, I guess, secluded activity or experiment would be write the person a letter telling them what you might want to tell them. And as the therapist doesn't even need to see the letter, just the process of the client writing what they want to say to this person down on a letter, and then they can burn that letter and send it to that person, or kind of just bring it to completion, which is what Gestalt is about. Gestalt means whole. It's German. It's Gestalt, whole, completion. The theory suggests that many of us have uncompleted elements of our lives, and we're looking for that completion. Maybe I think of myself of what I would like to have said to my dad that I didn't say to my dad before losing him. And I can do that by writing a letter and burning that letter and sending it to him, and it brings maybe a little bit of completion there. But those experiments can be so powerful, and I guess that keys into who that client is. What is their preferred communication method? Maybe they don't want to speak verbally. Maybe they just want to think about it or experience it. So it's very inclusive, I feel, Rory.
It is very inclusive. And I guess one of the reasons that Gestalt therapists take a long time in training is that there's lots of moving parts in Gestalt. And, I think it's especially worth mentioning that, we've touched on the 4 pillars of Gestalt, but Gestalt is so much more than that. It's about, as you say, completing the circle. There's no real direct translation for Gestalt from the German to the English, but most people would say it's a completion. It's sometimes referred to as homeostasis. And an example of that would be, I feel thirsty, I go to the tap, I turn the tap on, I fill the glass with a drink, I put the glass to my mouth, I drink, I'm no longer thirsty, and that homeostasis is complete. And what happens is that there are parts where emotionally we've not picked the glass up. So for instance, we've not said the unsaid, as you said, or written that letter, as you said about your dad. And what happens is that then that allows us to disconnect contact with ourselves. And we're missing parts of ourselves. And the whole point of Gestalt therapy is to connect not just emotionally to ourselves, but physically as well, because the emotional has a physical reaction.
Yeah, I like how you said that this is really a one drop in the ocean that is Gestalt therapy.
Yes.
It's incredibly deep, the theory. And we've created a handout. Rory created one of his super duper handouts for you on the 4 pillars of Gestalt therapy. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com. That is our mother website. Click on the podcast tab, make your way to episode 251. Right there on that page, you can download your super duper handout on the 4 pillars of Gestalt therapy. So there it is. That is our theory in practice for today. So moving on to practice today, Rory, guess where we look at what's current, what's contemporary in practice. And I think this is a really important topic, talking about sexual intimacy.
Absolutely. And this is a topic generated from a question I asked in our Facebook group. I asked what topics people would like to be addressed in the podcast. Contemporary topics, and sexual intimacy came up. And if you want to join our Facebook group, if you go to Counselling Tutor, just type in, if you go to Facebook, just type in Counselling Tutor, you'll find our Facebook group, and you'll find thousands of like-minded people. There's a lot of students, there's a lot of qualified colleagues, there are supervisors, there are tutors, different disciplines, different modalities, all talking about the world of counselling and psychotherapy. So we thank our Facebook group for providing this topic. And I'd like to start off with a bit of Latin, if I may. Homo sum humani nihila a me alienum puto. I am a man, nothing human is alien to me. It was Terence, the philosopher Terence, who of course was a Roman slave, who talked about engaging with humanity in all its aspects. And the reason I start off with this quote is because I think it's really important. Sexual intimacy is an important part of most people's lives. And it's a prism or a lens that we can look through with the client to see about how the majority of their life is working. But to do that, we need to be able to engage with the sexual intimacy. And if we're a little worried about it, or we're shy about it, or we feel shamed about it, or we push away from it, therefore the client won't be able to go there. And that important aspect of the client's reality is shut off. The door is shut, and it's shut by the therapist, not the client. The client's opening the door. The therapist shut it. So with that in mind, I think training should really focus on how we feel about sex, sexuality, sexual preference, kink, for want of a better word, for those people who like to try something different. So that's the first thing. And I think we should, when clients talk about sexual intimacy, it's something that's impacting on their entire life. It's part of their entire life. It's as important as their, as eating and drinking and physical health, sexual kind of activity, however that's performed, is an important part of the human condition. And sometimes clients want to talk about it. They may go through phases where they're struggling, sexually, erectile dysfunction or vaginal dryness, or it may be that for those who engage in different forms of sexual activity, they're struggling with it. I'm trying to be conscious, because obviously this is a podcast that goes out on a kind of family-friendly platform. But generally speaking, we should engage with it, and we should be able to talk about it and help clients understand, what they want and what they hope to achieve sexually.
Yeah. I just love how you covered how it is fundamental. It is part of most people's lives, yet It is not part of most social communications. It's sometimes something that is hidden away, something that people might feel shame around, discomfort around the topic. With some, I'm thinking of examples where a child might be approached by the parents who want to speak about the birds and the bees, and the child being terribly embarrassed and going, "Oh no, leave me alone! I don't want to hear about this kind of stuff." It can be a tricky area, and when a client maybe brings something from their intimacy, their life of intimacy into the therapy room, that is immense courage. That is immense courage. And an experiment that you can try for yourself in this is think about your own genitals. Think about your own life, sex life, or your intimacy. And now think about needing to go to a medical professional and tell them about that. What does that bring up for you? Think about what you would need to go through before uttering the first word there, the thoughts that you might go through. So when a client does come into the therapy room and brings that part of their life, if we're not able to warmly welcome and receive what they bring, if we medicalize it or speak only clinically, if we gloss over it and maybe change the subject or focus on another area that they're bringing, how might that feel for them? That maybe it's a part that is unacceptable to themselves that they dare show within the therapy room, and then it's overlooked or glossed over. And it may be that as the therapist, we think, well, I didn't train in sex therapy. I'm not the right person for this. Maybe I need to refer the person. Or what kind of a message is that sending? And of course, we do need to know when we're working within our competence and outside of our competence. That's what CPD is about. So if we are going to need to make a referral, then you do need to make a referral. But how is that done? And it's sometimes more about us than the client, us as the therapist than the client. What comes up for you when you think about sexual intimacy, when certain words are used, so to describe genitals, and again, we're mindful this is a family friendly, like you say, Rory, so we're not going to say the words, but you can think of them. You can think of those words. Are there any of those words that are a no-go for you? If somebody says it, that, I don't want to, that's not a good word for becoming comfortable with all aspects of that, and maybe showing the client that the door is open, that if a client does bring a little element of their intimate life, their sexuality, that we invite by going, you're most welcome to speak about that with me. Opening the door, saying it's okay, being non-judgmental and welcoming.
Absolutely. And, one of the things that's sometimes missed, I think, when we're talking about people's sexual preferences is asexuality, where people sometimes have no interest in sex. And we don't want to invalidate people. We don't want to get into the mode of, well, if you're not interested in sex, there must be something wrong with you. I had a colleague who many years ago disclosed to a trainer that she was asexual, and the trainer said, "Oh, well, that's something to do with attachment. There must be something wrong with you." And it wasn't that. It was just that she was on the asexuality spectrum, and as such, she wasn't interested in sex. It wasn't part of her, and we shouldn't invalidate people, and we shouldn't really, we shouldn't really be too surprised when people have different sexual preferences. That could be that they have different sexual partners or engage in kink. We may do a podcast on kink at some point. And I think also it's sometimes about when a client, their sexuality is waning, either through a diagnosis, they're ill, or maybe, the menopause. I mean, that is a big thing for women, vaginal dryness and drive and having to do other things instead of maybe penetrative sex. So I think we need to be in the spectrum of as Terence said, I'm a human, nothing human's alien to me. And if you do feel a little squeamish, and I think I'm going to own this. I've been a little squeamish about talking about this, mainly because of we have a lot of audience listeners who listen in the car, and little ears are around, so we're having to audit ourselves. But if this was a conversation which was amongst adults, or even young people who were showing an interest in sex, therefore we shouldn't be audited. We should talk frankly. We should talk professionally. We should engage. We could even use the language that they use. We wouldn't use clinical language, and engage with it. And I think if you think that's a bit of a tough ask, supervision, and ask a fundamental question. What embarrasses me? What makes me a little squeamish? And if that happens, it's okay, but you need to think about, well, how's that going to impact on the client?
Very much so. 5 tips on getting comfortable with talking about sex in therapy. The first one is open the door, as we've said, kind of welcome the topic and show an encourager if the client brings that topic in, showing that topic is welcome. Secondly, you can get a framework for talking about sex and sexuality. So if you trained as a sex therapist, you would be working to a framework. And I guess it's about doing some CPD. You don't have to go and train as a full sex therapist, but if you look around and know that frameworks do exist, and it's frameworks to work around and to talk around that make it comfortable. The third one is desensitize your giggles, blushes, and cringes.
Yes.
And that's about personal development. That's about journaling. That's about speaking with peers. That's about speaking with your supervisor. It's about really thinking, where are your tripwires? That if a person says, I don't know, they're thinking that they want to have a threesome, and you go, ooh, whoa, and suddenly you're in that no man's land where you go, I don't know what to do here. I don't, whoa. It's a big world out there with people with choice, and it's about being able to be there and know what sets us off, know when to refer out. Where is that line where you do need to make a referral? We don't want to be prematurely referring out. We want to be able to welcome and, of course, speak and have the discussion and give the platform to speak. But there are times we would need to refer out. And again, CPD is where we kind of learn where those lines sit. And know your blind spots, know the areas that it's more than blushing and giggling for you. So I'm going to use an example here. You may have grown up in a childhood where homosexuality was a sin, and you heard that message your whole life. Well, how would that be if a person presented that part of their life in your therapy room? Is it a blind spot for you? And if it is a blind spot, where do we go? Back to the CPD. CPD is where we can learn. It's about understanding where our hidden prejudices lie, working through those, taking them into supervision, and I guess expanding our knowledge and our working ability in service of our clients. It's interesting, isn't it, Rory, that so often the work is on self.
It is. And I would add one more thing, sexual health. Yes. Certainly if you're working with young people, you need to think about sexual health, use of condoms, use of, contraception. And also if there's, for those colleagues who are working with young people, there is so much pressure on young people nowadays with the rise of internet pornography to get into sexual activities that could be dangerous or, emotionally scarring, that sometimes, and I speak as a former child therapist, I've had to step in a little bit and say to a client, is this what you want? And in some cases, the person said no. And I said, well, everything has to be consensual. And if it's not what you want, and you have a voice to say, no, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important. I'm very pro information that can help people make the right decisions. And I've sadly, in my practice, I've seen a number, I'd say it's mainly young women who have been forced into things that they really didn't want to do, but because it's on the internet. Yeah. So, sexual health is really, really important. Things like chlamydia, get yourself some CPD on chlamydia, which if a young person gets it can have a chronic effect on them because, it can stop them having children. It can affect their health. That's before we go on to hepatitis C, AIDS, venereal disease. It's a really important, really, really important topic. And don't be afraid that if you feel a little out of your depth on the medical side, and the client is wanting more information, don't be afraid of saying, well, look, shall we make a referral? And maybe you could speak to someone who's got a little more information there. But I am human. Nothing human is alien to me. Engage in sexual intimacy in its entirety is what I would say.
Wow. So glad that that question was asked or that topic was raised in the Facebook group. As Rory's already said, get onto Facebook, type in Counselling Tutor, come and join that group and suggest the topics you want to hear in this practice today, where we look at the contemporary challenges, wins, and things that come up in our practices. We now go into practice matters. Rory, you held an interview. We're talking about PTSD and complex PTSD and the differences.
Yes, and I think it's so important. PTSD has become such a well-known term for stress disorder, flashbacks, and distress through something that's happened, a traumatic event. But now we're beginning to understand there's different forms of PTSD. I caught up with Lou Lebentz, who taught us or tells us the difference between PTSD and complex PTSD. And this is what she had to say. PTSD has become the byword for stress and traumatic responses in some people who've had very traumatic lives. However, recently has been identified a slight change or a slight update to that, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, sometimes known as CPTSD. And I welcome Lou Lebentz, who has made a fabulous lecture for our counsellor CPD and CSL library on complex PTSD. Lou, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me, Rory, and great to be here.
It's fantastic. So, post-traumatic stress is something that it's in the kind of vocabulary of therapists. But actually, CPTSD is something slightly different. So what is the difference, Lou?
There is a difference. And yes, I'm with you and I totally agree. So complex PTSD, which is, just for your information, it's not actually in the DSM-6, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, but it is in the ICD 11, I believe, which is the International Classification of Diseases, but it's not really that recognized. And I'm not quite sure why. I think we'll probably move on to that. But the difference is that PTSD can be from a single incident trauma. It from a one-off event like a car accident or a one natural disaster maybe, but complex PTSD is usually a series of traumas. And I'm not sure about people listening, but I know in my career, it's been very unusual for me to deal with somebody or work with somebody with just a single incident trauma. And when we're working with complex PTSD, they have all the visual and somatic and emotional flashbacks the same. They have an avoidance of triggers. They might have night disturbances or sleep disturbances, dissociation, anxiety, depression, self-destructive behavior, maybe coping with substances. But the complex PTSD has all of that and some. And the and some is really more of a difficulty with emotional self-regulation and this very negative view of self, which normally includes shame and guilt and feelings of unworthiness. And so there's a lot more of this, what we would call interpersonal disturbance going on, and this mistrust of others, if you like, and the world around them, which you don't really see with PTSD per se.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a very interesting distinction. I'd just like to rewind us back to what you were saying about DSM and ICD. So for those listening who may not be aware of those are clinicians' manuals, the kind of things that psychiatrists or psychologists might use to diagnose illnesses or you know, sometimes if I dare use the word, and please don't fill the post bag up, mental illnesses, which isn't a very popular phrase to use nowadays. And it appears in the international classification of diseases, but not in the American manuals, which is diagnostic statistical manuals. Now, to rewind us on, I think it's a very interesting distinction you make between the fact that PTSD is a single event, car crash, or might be someone who suffered trauma in war being shot at or something like that.
Yeah.
You know, difficult and traumatic as those are, complex PTSD seems to be a accumulation of traumatic events which impact on the individual. And I guess we would see that in the therapy room by clients maybe blaming themselves for their own trauma or blaming themselves for allowing abuse or traumatic experiences to happen to them. Would that be a good summary or a useful summary?
I would say that's a really useful summary. Yes, Rory, because there's a lot of self-blame and self-condemnation. And I find often with complex PTSD, those several events or of a long-term basis of trauma is very often rooted in childhood. And as we all know, and everybody listening knows, that our self-image starts to be developed in childhood. So if we have attachment disruptions or we have developmental traumas in our early years, then the view that we have of ourselves and the beliefs that we form about ourselves and the world are always what we call limiting or faulty schemas or cognitions about self. And usually, as we know too, children always blame themselves for whatever is happening around them and for whatever the adults do. So this I'm worthless or I'm unlovable or it's always my fault becoming built into their perceptions of themselves. So then if we've got that early attachment rupture or what I call developmental trauma, and then we put more traumatic incidents on top of that, whether it's bullying, whether it's sibling rivalry, whether it's problems at school, whether it's an illness of a parent or divorce or other what we call ACEs, which are the adverse childhood experiences and scale, then we are looking at a system that has had collective events of trauma happening within their world. And that's where we get the inability to manage our own emotional processing or our own affect, as we call it, and the affect dysregulation comes in.
Yes, and I guess that this speaks to attachment and attachment styles, and I'm sure that, you know, when we think of particular difficult attachment style, that would be disorganized attachment, which I'm sure, certainly in my experience, has been a byproduct of CPTSD. Yes,
and which comes first? So in my mind, if a baby isn't soothed and regulated and scaffolded up against another human being's safe and regulated nervous system, particularly we know in the first 18 months, but 3 years, then that is not a solid attachment or base of security, as Bowlby would say, is it? For somebody then to feel regulated, because actually the primary caregivers are the external psychobiological regulator of a child's nervous system. And if that nervous system is disrupted, there's too much stress, there's too much adrenaline, there's too much cortisol, and they aren't able then to learn how to self-soothe or self-regulate. And then, in my opinion, everything else then comes on top.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that is a really accurate summary. I know my little granddaughter at the time of recording this is 2.5. If she gets upset, she will hold my hand and I act as her co-regulator and regulator, soothe her words, and she keeps resets and she's okay in the world. You know, if she stays with us and she sees monsters, which sometimes happens, just hold her hand and say, there's no monsters, it's fine. And then she will drop off back to sleep again. So I guess it begs the question, Lou, what is the therapist's role when working with somebody with CPTSD? Is there a co-regulation element to the therapist's role?
Well, I think, Rory, that there's a co-regulation element to all of it. In fact, I think that's our main role and main job. We are the external, scaffold to somebody else's nervous system as they drop into what I would call hypo and hyper arousal states. We are this very secure ventral vagal regulated within hopefully our own nervous system that can help bring them back up or bring them down or bring them into a window of tolerance. And I hope we do that most of the time, most of us, through this lens of being attuned and calm and non-judgmental and empathic, and understanding that all feelings are acceptable within the therapy counselling room. And we help them to learn how to manage those feelings and tolerate, as DBT would say, that distress tolerance within their own system. And to me, that's our primary role, really.
I would totally agree. And when we talk about the ventral vagal system, what we're talking about is our own ability to regulate ourselves. And then by regulating ourselves and being calm and allowing and inciting the permission that all feelings are welcome within therapy, that the client can explore those feelings in a safe but contained environment. And of course, that relies on us being okay too.
Absolutely. I always say we can only swim as deep into the waters as we're willing to go ourselves. And the more work we do in this field on ourselves, and the more able we are to tolerate distress within our own neurobiological system, the greater ability we have to stay with whatever it is we're confronted with in the counselling room.
Yes, and I think this has been brought up in research, and there's lots of research that cites the fact the relationship is one of the primary ingredients of positive outcomes in therapy. I'm thinking of the work of John Norcross at Scranton University and Common Factors, even as far back as Sol Rosenwag, who talked about the dodo bird effect in the early 1900s. And I think it's an interesting place to be as a therapist, to offer that co-regulation. And I guess it strongly depends on who we are. I think that having your own therapy and engaging in your own therapy is a really important factor in that, to be able to understand ourselves in the service of others.
I do too. And I know that over the last I've done this for about 2 decades now. So I've done quite a lot of different types of therapy and healing and work on myself. And I would say that the strongest indicator for me is our ability to, I work quite a lot somatically now, which is with the body, and I use EMDR, which is eye movement desensitization reprocessing, for anybody listening that doesn't know about it. And there is a lot of somatic release with trauma. So the nervous system will hold on to these survival responses and the cortisol and adrenaline. So in EMDR, both my own personal EMDR and with clients, there is often a lot of release work that happens from the body. And that's not just crying. That can be shaking. It can be trembling. It can be legs running. That absolutely does happen as the kind of somatic system is releasing. So I think where we're going now with therapy and counselling seems to be much more of a body-led and body-based approach, aka, Bessel van der Kolk's The Body Keeps the Score, or Babette Rothschild's The Body Remembers. So more and more of our work, I think, is about staying with the body and allowing people to release. And I'm sure that anybody listening that has had their own counselling work with themselves or therapy work, we all know the therapists and the counsellors that can stay with feelings and don't take you away from it. And I'm sure we've all had experiences with people where it's almost quite or too quickly that we're moved on and out of it, really. And I think we need to stay much more with the feeling of what's going on for somebody and attune and empathize to that, because really that's the piece that got missed out very early on, very often.
Absolutely, and to stay away from the cognitive elements and stay within that feeling. And I guess that's why therapists such as Gestalt align themselves so strongly to trauma work. I know when I did my trauma-informed practice course, I was taught by a Gestalt therapist, and it struck me it was a almost perfect fit. And obviously I'm a person-centered therapist, so I built on a lot of the more bodily responses, working with bodily responses into my practice. Now, you made this fabulous lecture outlining these points in a lot more depth. What do you hope that people will take away from your lecture, Lou?
I hope that it will give them more of an understanding about trauma, because I think that there isn't the depth of training, perhaps, or teachings around trauma that there might be. And I know my first decade in the field, I spent on an addiction unit in London, and I didn't really even there know about trauma. And I think once you understand trauma, my opinion, Rory, and this might be a bit controversial, is that everything comes out of a dysregulated nervous system and trauma on some level. So whatever label or diagnosis or even disorder, which I don't like the word disorder, comes from us not being able to regulate ourselves in some way. And to me, that is an element of trauma, whether it's PTSD, complex PTSD, developmental attachment trauma, or just the collective trauma and the society that we grow up in, or the intergenerational elements that we're around. And I think if we could have a mindset that maybe a lot of what we're seeing comes in an element from trauma or chronic stress, even if we don't like the word trauma, then I think that we're working with the cause rather than the symptom. And that's what I'm very keen on getting across to people.
Well, I think that's an excellent summary. The lecture, The Difference Between PTSD and Complex PTSD, is available in our libraries, both in the student library, the CSR, and the counsellor CPD library for qualified counsellors. And it just goes for me to say, Lou Lebentz, thank you so much for joining us.
Big thank you to Lou. Big thank you to you, Rory, as always, for finding the guests and bringing in the good topics. And of course, there is, as mentioned, a lecture. Lou did a lecture for us, The Difference Between PTSD and Complex PTSD. It is available in our Counselor CPD library. If you're a member, you can log in and enjoy that. But it is such an important topic. I think it's been made available for us in our student resource library as well, in the CPD section there. So if you're a member, you can log in and get that full lecture. If you're not a member of our CPD library, just go to counsellingtutor.com. All the information is right there on the homepage. This has been episode 251 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast.
Yes, we started with theory and practice, and we explored the 4 pillars of Gestalt. We scratched the surface of Gestalt therapy and looked at the 4 pillars, the underpinning theories. In practice today, we talked about sexual intimacy and how to engage with clients who bring their sexual lives and their sexual appetites, for want of a better word, into the room. And then finally, we caught up with Lou Lebentz, who taught us about the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder and complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.